welcome to the regular City Council meeting for the City of Bellevue on August 2nd, 2021. It's a beautiful evening. We have a packed agenda, and this is our last meeting before a month break. So looking forward to working with everybody tonight. Clerk, could you please call the roll?
Yes, Mayor Robinson.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Neuenhouse.
Here.
Councilmember Barksdale.
Here.
Councilmember Lee.
Here.
Councilmember Robertson.
Good evening, I'm here.
Councilmember Stokes.
Here.
And Councilmember Zahn.
I'm here.
Thank you.
Councilmember Zahn, could you please lead us in the flag salute?
Happy to, Mayor. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. We have a proclamation today, International Overdose Awareness Day. Councilmember Lee, are you ready to read that, please?
Yes, Madam Mayor. But before I read the proclamation, I'd like to remind everybody that tomorrow is the primary election day. It's our privilege and duty to vote. Please vote. Thank you. Whereas International Overdose Awareness Day is a global event that is held on August 31st of each year to remember those gone too soon from overdose deaths. And whereas no community in Washington is immune to accidental or intentional overdose, and drug overdose deaths, more than 1,100 in 2018, remain high across the state. And in Bellevue, the rise in overdose deaths has been steep, with 16 so far in 2021, compared to 8 overdose deaths in 2018. And whereas Bellevue police officers began carrying the anti-overdose drug Narcan in 2019 to reverse overdoses from every potent opioids, such as fentanyl. And whereas addiction is a complex and treatable disease, and the life of recovery is possible. And whereas the City of Bellevue is committed to raising awareness of drug overdoses and supports local, county, and state efforts related to education, prevention, treatment, and recovery support for substance abuse disorder. Now, therefore, I, Conrad Lee, on behalf of Lynn Robertson, Mayor of Bellevue, Washington, do hereby proclaim August 31, 2021 as International Overdose Awareness Day in Bellevue, encouraging residents to stand by the growing number of neighbors who have lost loved ones to an overdose and are battling a substance use disorder themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. City Clerk, Deputy Mayor, is there a motion to approve the agenda?
I move to approve the agenda.
Second.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you.
Aye.
City Clerk, is anybody signed up for oral communications?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. This evening, there are 4 speakers signed up. And with that, I will call the first speaker, who's Els Bluma. And Ms. Bluma, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Your time begins now.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Els Bluma. I live in Northeast Bellevue. My address is on file. We've been hearing a lot about affordable housing and about the need for more housing in general. And now we're also heavily discussing providing housing for the homeless in our neighborhoods. What is the city's overall housing strategy at this point? It seems like many different proposals are on the table and various projects are being pushed down on us by the state and the county. The neighborhoods had been promised for years that certain housing decisions would be made when the sub-area plans are updated in new neighborhood area plans. However, as our neighborhood was going through the Great Neighborhoods program, we were told by staff and the Planning Commission that anything housing related would be discussed at a citywide level. Months have now gone by and we have not heard of any plans for such discussion. We're eagerly awaiting this housing discussion and resulting proactive plans with a roadmap for success for all. After the draft neighborhood plans had been completed, We found out through reading city council agendas that the state had passed laws that allow no barrier homeless shelters and housing in our neighborhoods and eliminate caps on unrelated residents in a dwelling. In addition, King County is purchasing hotels to house the homeless. One is coming right across the KinderCare daycare center here in Overlake, close to Bellevue schools. This shelter isn't even going to be to house our homeless people, but is mostly for homeless people bussed in from Seattle and elsewhere. Will this also be the case for other homeless housing and shelters that will come to our neighborhoods? How does all this fit into Bellevue's overarching plans for housing? How are you communicating at the state and county levels to protect our interests? How are you collaborating with surrounding cities? It seems like each jurisdiction is operating in isolation when working together would help the entire region and all of its residents. What is the implementation plan for these new ordinances? How do all the pieces fit into the puzzle? Let's take a step back, give staff a chance to perform or outsource the task in the interest of time, to study the proposed supportive housing best practices and assess the needs requiring consideration before final decisions are made on supportive housing. See how all this fits into the overall housing strategy for the city and ensure that all the implications are adequately addressed and resolved before moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bluma. The next speaker on the list is Arthur Young. And Mr. Young, I do not see you by name connected to the meeting. If you're connected with a phone, can you please press *9? Okay, I do not see Mr. Young. The next speaker on the list is Sally Lawrence. Ms. Lawrence, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great, your time begins now.
Thank you, Mayor Robinson and City Council members for this opportunity to speak. My name is Sally Lawrence. I live at 104 174th Place Northeast in Bellevue. I've lived in Bellevue for 28 years. I'm a retired water quality specialist for State Department of Ecology. I'd like to point to a deficiency in Bellevue's planning process. The deficiency is the inability to take a big picture approach to planning and to consider the growth happening in adjacent neighborhoods when the adjacent neighborhood happens to be in a different city. I participated in the Great Neighborhoods process for Northeast Bellevue over the past 2 years. We residents have asked our city planners to work with city planners in Redmond because we are already hugely impacted by Microsoft next door. And Redmond is planning a big city jump in intensity in the Overlake commercial area. This request to have some kind of city-to-city conversation in the planning process was ignored. Similarly, in South Bellevue, the city of Bellevue is starting a watershed planning effort for Coal Creek. This is a really good thing to do. However, if we really wanted to save Coal Creek, which is one of only 2 salmon streams in Bellevue, we would have taken this watershed approach years ago. Because the Bellevue planning process does not take a regional approach, the planners ignore what is already hammering away at Coal Creek. The city of Newcastle has added an intense little mini city along Coal Creek Parkway, and there are new Basel townhomes that will overlook Coal Creek from the Factoria side. To add insult to injury, there is now a proposed planned unit development that will be surrounded by Coal Creek Natural Area and will be right next to one of our most popular regional parks, King County's Cougar Mountain Regional Wildlands Park, with its access point at Redtown Trailhead. When are the planners going to consider the cumulative impacts of all these developments? The appropriate and legal way to assess such cumulative and regional impacts is through a full environmental impact assessment for any future and current developments on Coal Creek. I will be making this request to the head of Bellevue Planning, but I'm here tonight to alert you to these big picture problems that have significant impacts on our environment and the future quality of life in Bellevue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lawrence. The next speaker on the list is Patience Malaba. Ms. Malaba, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Your time begins now.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor Robinson and council members. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. For the record, I am Patience Malaba, Director of Government Relations and Policy at the Housing Development Consortium. I am calling to express both gratitude and concern today as it relates to the memo 21577, which is the work program around supportive housing best practices. First, it is clear to us all that fully addressing homelessness in our region requires a multifaceted solution, since people experiencing homelessness have a wide array of needs. We need housing across the income spectrum. We were so thrilled that you moved forward the final funding support for the first permanent supportive housing project in the city. And we were very confident of your ability to support the creation of more of this critically needed housing. We are, however, concerned now about the city conducting a study on best practices and regulations for supportive housing for two fundamentally important reasons that I want to note. The first one is that conducting a study on best practices, many of which housing providers already use, would usher in further regulation for supportive housing. It would disincentivize the production of this critically needed housing and unnecessarily burden the city staff with the responsibility to study these practices and regulations. Secondly, a separate study in and itself is an effort to reinvent a wheel that already exists. Rather, we respectfully encourage you to allow the compilation of best practices that providers already use into a leaflet or pamphlet that can be shared with other providers of supportive housing to encourage uniform use and education on them. I so appreciate your leadership through this change and growth as a city. We know that change is really hard. We fear it and we fight it, but you are leading us through it all. So with that, I want to thank you for all the work you're doing and hope that you take into consideration our recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Malaba. And I still do not see Mr. Young connected. So at this point, I would do a call out for any additional individuals who would like to provide comment under oral communications. Please use the raise hand function or *9 if connected with a phone. Mayor, I see one hand, and that is Christian Dorset. Mr. Dorset, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great, your time begins now.
Oh, hey, thanks, everybody. You're doing a really good job. I appreciate all the hard work, finally getting Milet out of here. I mean, he left and fire him, but then we don't have to pay for breaking his contract. I get it. It makes sense. Got to play by the rules, play by the book, right? The problem with Facebook I'm having right now is I just can't talk on the police main page. It's weird and they don't respond. Facebook doesn't respond. I'm trying to talk to them about it. I'll just make a new account. And if that one can't post, then obviously it must just be on my end. So that's I shouldn't make a silly thing about that. They did ban me in 2015 before Trump got over and messed the DOJ up and ruined everything. But there's complaints going on about that. It's not about you guys in the council. I mean, you knew about it, but it's not you. I think we should get police having cameras now. We have the technology to do that. I mean, I got a camera in the car now. It takes no power. The technology is great for the resolution. There's no excuse to have that absent in the department. Everyone, a camera has to be policy. Citizen complaint review board would be a good thing, I think, too, just so people can double check. It's always good to verify. I think there should be no more gas commercial landscaping stuff. I run a landscaping business. It's hard to get any work right now for me, but my brother does a lot of the stuff. We just use electric tools. It's cheap, it's easy, it's silent. We can work on a Sunday. We don't wake babies up. There's no noise, there's no gas. It's fantastic. I would recommend if the city can work towards that. I mean, yes, if you are a residential, you have commercial people come, they should have electric stuff if you pay for it. I mean, it's worth the money. No more gas. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Dorset. And I do not see any additional hands raised. So, Mayor, that would be the end of oral communications.
Okay, thank you. So we have council business and we have a new initiative. We're going to start with Councilmember Barksdale's recommendation to the Planning Commission. Councilmember Barksdale.
All right, thank you, Mayor. I recommend Creighton Webele as the new planning commissioner to fill the open position on the planning commission. Creighton understands where we are as a community and how important the work pertinent to the planning commission is to ensuring Bellevue is affordable, welcoming, and sustainable. He brings to the commission perspective from living abroad in Europe and Japan and his familiarity with the evolution of Bellevue over the course of his time in the city. Creighton has completed Bellevue Essentials, shows up prepared. You've read about the relevant plans and initiatives such as the Grand Connection and neighborhood plans prior to the interview, and cares deeply about ensuring the community is engaged in the planning process. So I put forward Creighton Webele as for recommendation.
He's also a very good tennis player. So is there a second to that?
I'll second.
Okay, all those in favor of appointing Creighton Webele to the Planning Commission, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, terrific, thank you. All right, next up, we have a new initiative that Councilmember Robertson asked staff to report on or propose to us. And I'd actually like to allow Councilmember Robertson to introduce this first and then have staff do their presentation. So go ahead, Councilmember Robertson.
Thank you, Mayor. So last week, I talked about the reason I wanted to look at best practices for supportive housing is that it seems like the right time right now when we are starting to fund supportive housing and when the Planning Commission is engaging on the interim official controls related to supportive housing. I am very concerned that we provide, if we're going to be funding these kinds of projects, which I strongly support doing, that we fund ones that are very, very effective, that provide the supports needed to help the folks who are living there both stabilize, live a high quality life, and get the help they need to move on to whatever they want to do next. So the first step is figuring out what the best practices are for supportive housing. At that point, staff would come back to council and we would discuss the best practices and decide, do we want to create a leaflet, for example, to educate about what best practices are? Do we want to put these into our funding agreements so that they're a condition of funding? Or do we want to potentially put something into the land use code? I don't know which of those three or combination thereof is the right approach, but I do know that I want that the people who live in supportive housing projects to have adequate support. And I want them to be accepted, the projects to be accepted by the neighborhoods and, be good neighbors and have neighbors be good neighbors back to them. So I brought this new initiative forward to make sure that we can look at these best practices. And I'm hoping that council will support doing the work. The question last week was, do we have the capacity to do the work? And the answer is yes. Staff says this will take about 90 days. It'll be part of the other work they're already doing on some of the housing. And it may, fill things up and slow a few things down, but not substantially. And it's very much in line with the work we're already doing with regard to housing, supportive housing, etc. So I would ask the council's support to initiate this work with the expectation that staff would come back in 90 to 120 days and share with us what best practices they found and how they think we can implement those into Bellevue. Okay, and I'm happy to make a motion when the time is right. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Miyake, would you like to introduce staff to present?
Sure, sure, Mayor. The staff taken a look at, and the lead staff on this is Mac Cummins, along with Mike Brennan, who have taken a look at that. I'm going to go ahead and turn over to you, Mac. There was a memo included in your packet with answering some of the questions that were just raised by Councilmember Robertson, and I'll turn it over to you, Mac, to kind of walk through that memo with the rest of the council.
Thank you, City Manager Miyake. Good evening, Mayor and Council. We submitted a memo that was in your packet here and was out for public review over the weekend, effectively answering some questions that the council had at last week's meeting relating to this item. So as a quick recap, during your discussions last week about whether or not to initiate a work program amendment, council asked us some questions about opportunity cost, how big or what was the scope of the work that was being requested, when could it be brought back, and so forth. So, and there was one other set of considerations relating to timing. As Councilmember Robertson just mentioned, the city will be taking up later tonight work on interim official control ordinances and referring that work to the Planning Commission. So there were questions about the codependency of these two bodies of work or how the different timing considerations would work. So what we did was put together a memo for you all to outline our thoughts on how this could proceed forward if you chose to initiate a work plan amendment this evening. We do think it would take roughly through the end of October, November timeframe to evaluate best practices in the 5 areas that Councilmember Robertson has suggested considering. Bring back those to you at that point for a conversation around implementation. The other thing that we would intend to do is take a look at the best place to put those kinds of regulations should the city council decide to implement them at that time. And there may be multiple options or there may be one. And so that would be part of the analysis. There could also be impacts to resourcing, both at the staff level and potentially funding. And so we'd want to take a look at that and bring that back to you should you choose to implement additional regulations around permanent supportive housing. So what we've tried to give you this evening is a recap for what the next 90 days or so would look like as we start that analysis. Our thoughts are that it is symbiotic with other work program items that are already ongoing, but would have an impact in terms of potential delay of some of those items because they're the same people that are working on things that are trying to get through the commission or trying to bring things back to the council. We see those delays in weeks and think it would be better if you chose to initialize this and start it tonight to actually fold it into the work program rather than completely stopping something else to start this. That would allow all the housing work to keep going, but it would have a delay effect in a few areas, and we've outlined those in the memo. So, with that, I'll be happy to stop here. If the council wanted to initiate tonight one or all of those items, we think that the October-November timeframe would still allow enough time for anything that was referred to the Planning Commission to still be worked into the IOC work. So I think that answered the questions the council had at the last meeting, and then we're happy to offer any other thoughts if you have questions on those items for us.
Thank you. So I'm going to open this up for discussion, but when we vote, I'd like to vote on these individually. So there are 5 recommendations from the memo, and I wonder if staff can put those up on the screen for us.
I think I'm going to look to Charmaine to see if we'll be able to do that. We listed them off numerically 1 to 5 about midway through the first page of the memo.
Right, but I'm not sure that everybody has access to it right this second. So be nice if we're working off of the same thing. But
and
just
Mayor, I was going to add, after last week's discussion, I kind of added and any other best practices that staff finds. So that's not actually listed, but it was a general overarching umbrella.
So it would be a number 6?
Yes.
Okay. Got it. So I'm going to, thank you. So you see those listed 5 things there, and then number 6 is any other best practices. So I'd like to open this up for discussion, kind of just a free discussion on whatever you want to talk about. And do I see any hands up, people who want to speak to this? I see Councilmember Lee, and I see Councilmember Stokes. So we'll start with Council, and I see, okay, hold on. Write this down. So we have Lee, Stokes, Zahn. Anybody else? Okay, Newenhouse. Is that all? Okay, I'll put myself in there. And me. Okay, Councilmember Lee, under 3 minutes, please.
Thank you. 3 minutes. I support what Councilmember Robertson brought up. As we heard last week, we talk about supporting supportive housing, supportive services. It's very important. That really is the key word. Also second thing is devil is in detail. And we have been doing a lot, the city of Bellevue, the last few months, more than a lot of other people have, city have. And I'm very proud of this, and we're doing it in a very good speed. The key is that the devil is in the detail in the sense that we have been working on this with our community support, and they've been very collaborative, and I think it's worked very well with regard to Congregation for Homeless, and they've been very successful, very satisfying. The question now is with the Plymouth housing, and we definitely support the model. The key is operationally, how do we make sure that we have the best practice? But to me, it's even more than best practice. I didn't step into when you add this 6 overriding thing. Bellevue has to lead. We are leading in this effort. It's not just copying what other people have done, but it has to be specific that it works, and we've proven it works, and we're going to do more to make it work. So I would really say that it's the Bellevue way. And so I think we need to look at all the ways that can make the project work and for the whole overall benefit overall program, including, as we mentioned consistently, mental health. That's very key. How do you make that work? What is the detail to make it work? This depends on the situation. And so I think we need to emphasize that. So I think the engagement, the neighborhood, you mentioned outreach, number 5. I want to emphasize that one. All the rest of the thing is good. They just have to work on the details, but final one, the neighborhood's not just outreach. I think we need to engage them. We don't want to just have it all done and say, well, it's done. We outreach and what it is going to happen. I believe that we need to have their help, just like we've had in Congregation for Homeless, that the neighborhood group has been very, very productive, helping to make sure that whatever we do fits and is right for the Bellevue way. So I like to make that modification, or at least remind us when we do it, it's not just outreach, say we have done it and you just know about it, but we actually want them to hear them, to see what we can do to make it work for all of us, for the inmates, for the patients. I use the wrong word, not inmates, for the client, for the people we serve, for all of us. I think it's very important. It's the whole program. So I'm really interested and I support this. We don't want to do it, delay it, but I think we can do it. And I believe also, last word, if we need resources, it's our council's responsibility to provide resources. It's important to us. Okay, so that's our job, find resources to do it. Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Stokes.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I really appreciate the staff outlining all of this and looking at this. As I said before, I think we're, to a certain extent, proposed solution looking for a problem. And a lot of it is just kind of signaling. My biggest concern is taking a lot of time to redo stuff or look at stuff in a way that is kind of prescriptive of the things we don't like government kind of doing, and not really coming together on this and spending time that could be spent on something more productive. And also setting up, again, a concept that it's saying that we don't quite trust the people who are doing this business, and we don't quite trust the people who go in there to behave themselves. And I think there's a better approach to it. I'm sorry, my dog is responding to my voice, I guess. I think we're overloading this, and I think Patience Malaba made a very, very good point. We can work on this without going through this whole complex process. We can get best practices. We can why don't we start out by talking to the people who provide the services? By the way, Plymouth Housing is not, they're already doing this project, so we're not talking about them. But as we know from them, they already have processes in place. And I just think we have to be careful that we don't continue to say that Bellevue is a difficult place to actually get care for our citizens homeless and working and need assistance. And we can do this without making it look like so prescriptive. That's my biggest concern. And I think we could do this. And I don't like to keep putting other things off. There was an article in the paper today about the light rail and why light rail is so expensive and the years it's taken to get something decided on that. Even more simple things like this takes us forever. And I just think it's a solution that is overblown for what we're trying to reach. And I think we can get it to in a better way. But I do support the whole idea, and I appreciate Councilmember Robertson bringing this up. And that let's look at best practices. Let's come up with something fairly simple. But when we start asking people, we're going to start asking people, a safety and security plan requirement for it. Well, they probably have one. A ratio of staff caregivers to residents. Are we going to dictate the numbers of those? I think these are just things that it's a good idea, but we're just overdoing it and imposing on things that are even more urgent to get involved. So I'm just having a kind of concern why we're doing this at this time, particularly since we're not talking about projects in place. I just think we can take a lower key, better, more positive, and better actually doing a job in the long run by not going this in this depth in this approach.
Okay, thank you. You have more to say. I'll come back to you.
Okay.
Councilmember Zahn.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I would say that Councilmember Stokes said a lot of what I have been thinking about, which is also what Councilmember Barksdale brought up last week, which is the fact that we can have this conversation and a compilation of best practices into a pamphlet. And I believe that Patience Malaba actually talked about the fact that those very providers that know the most about how to ensure the most success for supportive housing would be at the center of providing that type of document. So I guess I think about having these conversations in a way that isn't a burden to our staff that's already working on the very things that we've said is the most important to us, and not reinventing the wheel for things that already exist from the very providers of the service. And when I look at the list here, it isn't that there's no impact, because we have said that working on affordable housing is the most important piece that we're working on. We also last week talked about spending some time looking at what kind of maximum height we might want in East Maine to be able to incentivize affordable housing. When we were at the retreat, one of the things that we voted on to also have in the work plan was to consider and do a study on a safe parking program. So what I see is that by adding this to the work plan, these other things are going to get pushed. So my concern is that we can work in partnership with the very providers that are the experts in this area, instead of asking our staff to do a study and do this work ourselves. So I'm absolutely committed to the success of supportive housing. I just don't believe that this is the approach that's the most appropriate at this time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Mayor Noonhouse.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, really appreciate the conversation so far, and a lot of good comments. And certainly, Councilmember Robertson, I appreciate you moving this forward, and also with staff just in outlining this in the memo. From my perspective, there's little to no impact. It can be done in 90 days. I think the timing is right. I would certainly like to know that the city of Bellevue is adhering to best practices when it comes to supportive housing. And I really don't see any downside. I don't see that at this point right now in the conversation, we need to make a decision in terms of which ones we may want to look at, including in the LUCA or further emphasizing it through different channels, as Councilmember Robertson mentioned. For me, I'd just like the staff to come back list some of the best practices, and then as a council, we can make decisions about the ones that we feel are appropriate or not appropriate. I think we're all on the same page in terms of we do not want to slow down any progress that we've made as a city. I don't think that's our intention at all. At the same time, I want to know what these best practices are. I want to make sure that we're adhering to them. It kind of goes back to what we heard during oral communications from Elsa Bluma. I think, residents want to make sure that we're approaching this in the right way. We're looking at the impacts to any community or neighborhood. And we're balancing that with moving as fast as we possibly can to create this type of housing. So I don't see any harm. There's very minimal impact. So I look forward to supporting this, and hopefully looking forward to a good a good discussion with staff is able to come back with some recommendations or best practices for us to debate and discuss. Thank you.
Oh, I think you're muted, Mayor.
Thank you. So I was talking to you. That's interesting. You knew that. So I was going to see if you wanted to speak before I do.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. I think Councilmember Zahn and Councilmember Stokes have hit some of the points that I would have hit. I guess the way I see this is we're delaying strategies that would create affordable housing, which we've talked a lot about. For strategies that would make it more difficult for affordable housing or permanent supportive housing to be built in the city. I guess I just can't support that trade-off there. And if we were to say we're curious about what the best practices are, I think the approach that's already been mentioned in terms of talking with the permanent supportive housing developers is a really good way to find that out and capture those in a pamphlet. And I think the permanent supportive housing developers are already incentivized for their projects to work in the community because they're not in the business of just generating a profit. They're in the business of trying to help the people that they're serving through permanent supportive housing. So they're already motivated to build projects that work and write well into the community. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. And I was going to say the same thing. These are not profit-making projects. I'm not interested in creating a more burdensome process for the developers who are able and willing to create the supportive housing that we need to serve the people in our community. So I will not be voting yes on all of these, but there are two that do interest me, and we are voting to ask staff to look further into this. It's not yes or no on actually adopting anything. It's just tonight we're looking at asking staff whether or not we want them to go beyond 8 hours to look further and make a recommendation to the council with pros and cons. So number two, I'm very interested in because I know that supportive services are required for success with the population that we're housing. And on-site is the best thing you can do for them. So I'm going to be very interested in knowing, based on best practices for the population being served, what kind of on-site supportive services staff would recommend or how we might put that into something, an agreement. And then number 5, we recently have experienced what happens when we don't have community outreach, when Redmond is citing permanent supportive housing in Redmond, but on the border of Bellevue. And there's been no outreach to the Bellevue community, to the people who live in Bellevue in that area or who frequent the services there. And I don't know about the rest of the council, but I'm getting a lot of emails from concerned residents that would probably support this if they knew more about it. So I'm very interested in having information on how we might require community outreach if we're citing a facility like that. So those are the two that I will be voting yes for. But the rest actually, I think, slow down the process and make it harder to do these very necessary projects. And again, the projects going in here, the people doing it are not doing it to make money. They're doing it to help the community. So the best practices are going to be changing year to year, population to population. So we need to have some flexibility in what we require. So is there any, do you want to go around again? Is there anybody else who'd like to speak? I see Councilmember Stokes, I see Councilmember Barksdale, Councilmember Robertson, Councilmember Zahn. So and I see Lee. So we'll start with Councilmember Barksdale.
All right, thank you, Mayor. I guess just one question, a couple questions. One, what time would it take to look at a subset, so the two that were mentioned, and how does that impact the work plan? And then secondly, I know that I think Councilmember Robertson said, and other best practices. So how does that play into that idea of looking at these piecemeal?
Mayor, if it's okay, I think I'll respond to that. Obviously, having only 2 of the 5 things will reduce the total amount of staff time in terms of research analysis, generating pros and cons, and where the 2 things, how they're best done for cities that do regulate permanent supportive housing in those areas. Obviously, then what would happen is there'd be less delay for the items that we've suggested could experience a delay, should you advance forward. On the second part, I'm not sure I've heard from the council yet, individually or collectively, about a catch-all for all best management practices. We understood that to be hey, while you're out, talking to providers or other cities, if there are things we should be thinking about, please don't just immediately eliminate them, but bring them back to us as well. But probably be good to get some specific direction if council wants us to be out with a catch-all on all things permanent supportive housing.
Okay. All right. Do you have anything else, Councilmember Barksdale?
I guess just my uncertainty there is just if you're out and you observe things and they come up, and I would imagine, and you bring them back to council, I would imagine that means you would have had to spend time digging into those as well in order to get to any level of confidence of bringing those back to council. So the scope might creep beyond just the 2.
That's a question or a statement?
Question. Or looking for feedback.
Matt, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think what we would want to look for some direction from the council is probably to either make sure we're all on the same page, that be relatively narrowly scoped. So if there's a topical area that is a permanent supportive housing thing that is typically regulated somewhere else, we could look at that and bring it back to you, but not be sending significant staff time out looking for that. That would have a significant impact to the work plan. So the way this came up last week and the way we evaluated it was basically not to eliminate something if we saw something in our research that we thought the council should know about, but not to be aggressively out looking for something that hasn't come up in conversation
yet. Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Stokes. Oh, I can't hear you yet.
Well, I think that narrowing it to these 2 is interesting. I suspect, one, the question was brought up about Seattle or about Redmond. The requirement for certain on-site supportive services actually is a requirement that the King County has in the 1590 funding. And that would be a really easy one to find out about. The number 5, net outreach and relationship building, that's a good thing to do. So we can agree on those things. I'm just not sure that we need to spend a lot of time going back and trying to find all this stuff out. And what I'm concerned about, again, is it says in the agenda item here, or in the up above, there are some significant things that will be delayed that are ongoing right now. And again, it's this idea and this optics of, so Bellevue is getting itself engaged in process and looking at things and studying and taking time, and 80 days, 90 days is a lot of time on things we're doing, because we're just not concerned about, we're controlling things too much, and we're worried about having these people, developers come in who are doing this work and not, they're not doing for profit, and requiring all of these things for these people so we can keep them from, interrupting the neighborhood. The optics and the tone of this is just not what we need to be doing now in Bellevue. We can get to these things. And frankly, I think we go around and talk to people who are doing this, they're going to say yes, like Plymouth did. Okay, here it is. This is what we do. We don't go around and talk to people who are putting up a housing unit, a regular apartment complex. How do you control people in your apartment from doing things which they do all the time? I mean, it's just human nature. So I'm just concerned about the optics of this. I think we can reach the goal of having good processes, good best practices, without spending a lot of staff time on really needy things to be done in these next 3 months or so going into the new year, because we are really moving forward. And I think it'll put a little brakes on what we're doing. And then we're going to have to come back with all of these things, and then we're going to have to talk about them. And given practices in the past, it'll be 3 months to a year before we come up with a finally solution on these things. So I'm just having a hard time thinking why we're spending time on this now when we could get a better solution. And frankly, if we could go out and have staff talk to, or I'm sure they're already talking to them, but people who are in the business now, find out what they're doing other places. Find out what King County's doing. Redmond has practices in place. They're not just throwing that thing out there. I do think the idea of having on the neighborhood part in the bottom or a way to communicate better with our neighborhood, with our other cities. The fact of the matter is, actually, Redmond was putting out information. I saw it in Nextdoor. I saw it in other things a week to 2 weeks before the final announcement was made. So we can do better there with our neighbors. And we don't do a lot of going to Redmond and saying, we're building something right close to you and we won't tell you what we're doing here. So that's something I'd like to work on. But I just think this is just the overkill in terms of looking at a problem when there are other approaches to it. And frankly, I think in a few weeks we could find out what the answers were to all these things, not months.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Robertson.
Sure. No, I agree that we should be able to get these answers in a few weeks. And that is what staff said it would take. They're already doing work on supportive housing. They're already doing work on these issues. So this would just be to expand it a little bit to see how we can do things the best way. When Bellevue decided to take the 1590 money, that meant that we were going to control and fund supportive housing projects, homeless shelters, affordable housing. What's the other category? I'm blanking on it. But all the different kinds of housing that are so needed. If we're funding them, we want to make sure that they're done in the best way possible. I would fully expect that the work of figuring out the best practices would involve talking to providers, would involve talking to and looking at what other cities are doing. That's the work we're talking about doing. We're not talking about we're going to adopt this thing in the land use code. We're going to put such and such as a condition of the funding agreement, or we're going to put it into a pamphlet. If we want to do anything and understand these, I personally need to know more about making sure that what comes to Bellevue in a really effective way for the people living there. We've seen where it's been done really well. And we've seen, like in the case of my brother, we've seen where it hasn't been done so well in the case of some of those supportive housing projects in Seattle, where it's the most dangerous block in the city. They have more 911 calls by far than any other place in the city. That's where we don't want to see that happen here, because that's not good for the people that are living in those facilities, and it's not good for the people who are living around those facilities. Supportive housing is something where the folks need support. So I appreciate the mayor looking at the on-site supportive services. That's one of the key things that can make these work, depending on the type of supportive housing project that it is. So this is not a big delay. It is working, basically just expanding by a little bit the work that staff is already doing on this. And so I think if we want to be a council that really thinks about how we fund these things, fund the ones that are the most effective ones for the people, we need to know what the best practices are, because I don't know the answer to that. And how can we evaluate supportive housing projects that are asking Bellevue for funding if we don't know what makes the different projects really effective? So yes, the nonprofits are going to know a lot more, the ones that are doing it, but I'm of the belief that, trust but verify, right? We need to look at what is happening, because there are some nonprofits like Plymouth that are far better and more effective than others. And so if we don't know what the best practices are, how can we ever evaluate it? I need that input from staff. I don't want to have to look through every grant agreement and say, well, what is this? And investigate every one as an individual already employed outside the home full-time, as well as being a council member on every time we have a project come forward. I want to have a set of, this is what we're looking for. This is what we know works. This is the supports that this group needs. Does this project meet it? Yes, let's fund it. That's what I'm looking for. And so I would hope that we would have, considering what limited impact this has on the work plan, that we would have support for that, because that's the information I'm going to need going forward every single time. We can do it once, or, we can do it every time. I mean, this seems like the best way to go. So, because we're already doing this work now. So I'd appreciate support of the council and my colleagues. Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Zahn.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. So as I'm listening to the comments, I guess here's where I am wondering. So this particular item, as it's currently framed, is talking about item for study, best practices, and regulation. And yet, when I think about those two items, Mayor, that you brought up, I'm trying to understand as well. So item number 2. So in studying that, what is the purpose? That we're going to hold ourselves accountable for funding? Because my understanding is that when we had the 1590, that there was a lot more being requested than we actually funded. So is this, so I guess my whole comment is that if what we're trying to study in number 2 is what level of on-site supportive services we're going to need so that we are adequately funding the 1590 money for that, that is a different discussion than study best practices and regulation. It's more about holding ourselves accountable that we are going to fund adequately because we chose to take the 1590 money instead of King County. So it doesn't seem like it completely fits into this particular item that we're talking about, although I believe it's an important thing as we look at the 1590 and how we make sure that we're putting adequate monies in for the on-site supportive services. And then on the second one, I agree that it is important to be good neighbors and have the outreach. But again, I'm just trying to understand in the context of this particular item and framing, whether this is the best way to get at that, or if it's more of connecting with the very folks that are providing these services for how best to do that outreach versus putting it into some land use code. Thank you.
Well, remember, we're voting on asking staff to evaluate this and make a recommendation with pros and cons. So this is a start, but they may come back with a different recommendation that is written here. Excuse me, 5. Councilmember Lee.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not here to argue and debate. I am here to make sure that this project is the best. It's a good project that actually works for everybody, for the clients as well, for people who live there, because it is to improve their welfare and being. And I think that what the public believes in. We all, as each council member, have our own ideas and thoughts. But we have seen that, and that's why we put so much emphasis on neighborhood, on community engagement, because they have been very successful, demonstrated, and we represent them. They are the community, and they are on board, and we need to have them to help us to make sure that it's the best. And we don't have a simple, quick formula. This is not a simple project. This is a big deal. We haven't had a real clear success example. Maybe we have, but we need to do more. So I think best practices are important. However, we need to be sure that it's more than that. It's something that we as a community, we as council members represent them, that we can help to make it even better, if it's possible. If it's already the best, that's fine. We use it. But I think it needs to be considered. And I agree with the mayor. I don't know all of that stuff. It's maybe others. When we start looking at best practices, there are other things. That's the staff's responsibility to tell us what makes this the best there is, or the best we can make it. And, so I'm not, that, but the one that I really agree with the mayor, that I personally is the supportive service is important. We all recognize that. So that needs to be there. And I also agree, as I said, neighborhood engagement, but it's more than just outreach, more than just using the sounding board, but actually have them help us. Well, what is the things that we may be missing? The 7 of us, there's 145,000 people out there, more, and they are living there. And so the only thing I want to add on the mayor is that safety and security is important. It's not just for us, for the resident, but for the resident of Bellevue, but it's safety and security for everyone, people who live there, the clients, the people who are, living there. And so they have to be safe. They have to be secure. It's for there. So I think all these are things that we need to learn. We need to find out more. We need to have the community helping us, support us, because that's how we can get support. That's how we can get encouragement and so on. And we represent the public. And we've seen, it's proven, this good neighbor plan is working well with Congregation of Homeless. So why not have them help Plymouth? I have good experience with Plymouth. I mean, I've seen the good presentation they made. I was very impressed. I like what they're talking about. I like what they're saying. Absolutely good. But they need to have also some assurance from us that we are in agreement, that they will continue it, and we are able to do so and remind it. So it's a understanding.
Thank you, Councilor.
Yeah.
Really,
so
thank you.
Thank you. That's it, really. Thanks.
So, I really liked what Councilmember Zahn said about the requirement is not just for the provider, but also for the city, that if we ask for support services based on best practices, it probably also is a commitment that we will fund those services. I come to this as the representative on the Mental Illness Drug Dependency Oversight Committee. And I've looked at their research for 5 years, and I know that there are some supportive services that are more effective than others. For example, on-site drug, addressing drug and alcohol addiction. On-site services for that is extremely effective. And you may have to pay more to have that as opposed to sending somebody on a bus across to a site in Seattle so they can get the services there. Most people won't pursue that. So it is important to me that we have high standards of support services that actually have been shown to work, and that we're committed to providing the funding for them, so that the people in Bellevue who require the support and are in this type of a facility have the best chances of recovery and success. So that is my pitch for number 2. And I think we'll go ahead and I will read each of these as proposed by Councilmember Robertson with the addition of number 6. And I would appreciate if you could raise your hand if you are voting aye so that I can see. So
clarifying, what was number 6 again? Sorry.
Number 6 is going to be and any other best practices. So I'm wondering.
Can I have a question, Madam
No,
Mayor?
just hold on. I'm working this out.
You are asking people to vote. I have a
No,
question
I'm not.
about
I'm
certain
talking,
items.
actually.
Okay,
So I'm wondering.
let me have a shot after you're done.
I'm wondering, City Manager or Charmaine, if we can vote without making a motion on these 6 and then make a motion to move these, whatever rises to the top with a majority vote to advance those. Or do we have to make a separate motion for each individual item?
This is the city clerk. Since you're not going to be taking them comprehensively as one motion, I would just suggest taking them as individual motions.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Councilmember Lee, what was your comment?
Yeah, it's number 5. I mentioned it repeatedly. Neighborhood outreach is one thing. I want to add emphasis. Understanding is neighborhood engagement. If you understand as a neighborhood engagement, I'm happy to vote.
I think that's up to Councilmember Robertson if she would like to change her.
Well, I wanted to make that amendment if that's the procedure.
All right. Well, when we get to number 5, I guess we'll take that up. I'll let you make an amendment to the motion. Councilmember Robertson, you had your hand up.
I did. And listening to the discussion, I'd like to just make we have a lot on our agenda tonight. I'd like to make a comprehensive motion that I think will hopefully get to where the council, at least the majority of the council is. So, and if we don't do that, we can take them up one by one. But I am going to move to direct staff and to Councilmember Lee's point, I think outreach is inclusive of engagement, but I don't mind adding it as a word. So I move to direct staff to initiate work to evaluate and bring back for council consideration best practices for supportive housing, including on-site supportive services and neighborhood outreach engagement and relationship building, and to bring these items back to council for discussion and potential future implementation.
Second.
Thank you.
So I have a question. Is that 2 and 5?
That's 2 and 5. Yeah. Number
Okay.
2, I said best practices for supportive housing, including on-site supportive services. That's number 2. Right. And neighborhood outreach engagement and relationship building. That's number 5. And to bring these items back to council for discussion. We're going to learn about them and potential future implementation.
Just clarify.
Yeah. That's
and I see Councilmember Barksdale has a question, and then Councilmember Zahn.
Just Matt, really quick question. Are either one of these possible to do within the 8 hours without impacting the other priorities? Just out of curiosity.
Councilmember Barksdale, no. They will likely require more than 8 hours, which is 8 hours total between all the people involved.
Are you wondering how much that will delay the existing work plan?
I am.
How much will an additional 8 hours delay our additional work plan, our existing work plan? Mac.
I may have misunderstood, Mayor. I understood Councilmember Barksdale's question to be if you take up one or only those 2 items, does it fit within the 8 hour allowance, or is it still over 8 hours?
And you said it's over?
It would definitely take over 8 hours for sure. And it will have an impact to some of those other housing programs. There's been a lot of discussion about big or small impact. I think those are sort of value-based words. The impact will be likely some delays in the items that we've listed off, which is some of the remaining items in the affordable housing work program and/or a few things that are trying to work their way through commissions.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Zahn.
Yes, I wondered, Councilmember Robertson, whether you'd be willing to read that one more time. I want to make sure I caught all of what you said. Thank you.
Sure. And as I'd remind the council that Mac had said weeks. This is not as far as any additional time to work on the work plan. Okay, I move to direct staff to initiate work to evaluate and bring back for council consideration best practices for supportive housing, including on-site supportive services and neighborhood outreach, engagement, and relationship building, and to bring these items back to council for discussion and potential future implementation. It was a little repetitive, but that's the motion that I read.
Point of order.
Just a moment. I'm going to let council members on finish her thoughts.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to hear it one more time because it was quite long. Wanted to make sure I understood it all. Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Stokes.
So my question is, the motion is made is not just restricted to 2 and 5.
In my belief, it is.
Read the motion.
Let's hear it again, Councilmember Robertson.
I should really rewrite it. It's got a little bit repetitive there for the consideration is used twice or bring back. But I move to direct staff to initiate work to evaluate and bring back for council consideration best practices for supportive housing, including on-site supportive services and neighborhood outreach, engagement, and relationship building, and to bring these items back to council for discussion and potential future implementation. And my understanding from MAC is that as they learn about, if they learn about other best practices, they'll bring them back. But this isn't going to mean that they're going to start doing a deep dive on everything. They're going to look at the 2 issues. And then if something pops up when they're looking at that, they'll bring that back too. That would be my expectation.
Well, that's not the way it reads. I mean, it basically you're saying you want to look at best practices in general, including these 2. If we want to confine it to these 2, we would just say, look at best practices and then cite the 2 pieces. This is a comprehensive, it really is a comprehensive motion you're putting out there.
Okay, Matt, are you interpreting it that way?
Mayor, thank you. I do follow Councilmember Stokes' point. So without wordsmithing too much, if the actual motion is to evaluate all best practices, that could insinuate that there's a much larger universe than I think has been the intent of the conversation here. It would be good if the intent is to really focus on those 2 things. I mean, I hope this is always the case. If we're out doing work for the council and see something you all haven't thought of and didn't come up in conversation, we try our best to bring best practices to you. I think the intent is we're trying to understand is what is the scope of what the council's trying to move forward with this exercise.
So my original proposal was for number 2 was a requirement for on-site supported services based on best practices for the population served. Is that different enough to specify that we're looking at that and not the whole gambit? Or is that too open?
If that's the will of the council, Mayor, I would understand that, and we'd be able to look at on-site services and the relationship, to the use and the populations being served.
Councilmember Stokes, does that serve your need? Because if so, we could make a friendly amendment to this.
No, that doesn't eliminate the main motion is to research best practices on the whole gamut. And
no, the motion is to
these 2.
No, the motion is on-site supportive services based on best practices. So only applied to on-site supportive services.
Well, you're amending number 2.
Yes, I am.
I thought we were talking about the motion before us.
Well, I'm saying, would that be a friendly amendment that would satisfy your concern with what's been proposed?
No, because the main motion is still there, Mayor. The main motion is to get best practices, including take out the broad.
I'm amending the first motion, but
can you state it? So,
Councilmember Robertson, are you able to state the motion to word it the way
Yes, of course I am. I'm happy to, the thing about this is staff knows what we're talking about. They're not going to get confused. They've heard the whole discussion, but I'm happy to amend the motion and wordsmith it. So I move to direct staff to initiate work to evaluate best practices for supportive housing. Instead of including, I'll say specifically, evaluating on-site supportive services based on best practices for population served and for neighborhood outreach, engagement, and relationship building, and to bring these items back to council for discussion and potential future implementation.
I think Councilmember Stokes is asking you to take out the very first supportive housing.
I changed it to specifically.
Housing.
I changed it to specifically rather than including. So I think that should solve the problem. Does it solve the problem, Councilmember Stokes?
It gets closer. Yeah.
I'm just interested in number 2 and number 5 personally. So
that's what I'm trying to accomplish.
Well, yeah, but you're getting close enough to that. The other factor I want to say in this too is that I have a tremendous amount of trust in the staff this is staff work to look at this. And, we like to do that as well. I assume that we will look at the best practices. We did that with Plymouth. We will look at this. So we're kind of asking them to do something they're kind of going to do anyhow. But I do like cutting it down to a smaller amount because it's not just weeks, it's 3 months or more, and guaranteed these things take longer. So this is an improvement.
Is there a second to that motion? New motion?
Second.
Okay. Any questions or comments, Councilmember Barksdale?
I guess just a question about, so I know we're trimming it down to fit with, to minimize the impact. I mean, I wonder if there's a way to just limit the time frame. If it's 8 hours and if it's a matter of weeks, can we say, like, put a max time that we want staff to spend on it?
Yeah, I think you can do that. So what is the max amount of time that you would like to propose?
Yeah, I guess looking to Mac to get a sense of where's that sort of tipping point of it starts to have more of an impact on other priorities.
Well, one of the things we always strive for, of course, is to do work very well, and bring back, the appropriate amount of staff effort so that you can all have a good policy discussion when something, arrives back on your desk. We're also very fond of saying, don't let perfection be the enemy of great. So, I mean, it's somewhat difficult to try to back into a number of hours on this when you're also trying to weigh the other work plan items. The staff are operating at over capacity right now on planning initiatives and housing work. So as we look to bring this back to you, our best advice for you, if you want to take some of these up, and now there's discussion about 2 of the 5, that we would want to try to fold that into our existing work program compared to stopping something else completely and then just working on this and then getting back to it. But it would have an impact. There's only so many bodies at City Hall doing all this different work.
Are you through, Councilmember Barksdale, or do you want to try to put some sort of time limit on this? I mean, I feel like what was proposed for all 5 was 120 hours. You said about 3 weeks, right? And so to limit it to 80 hours, which would be 2 weeks, or 40 hours, which would be 1 week of time, taking into consideration what staff has just told you.
Mm-hmm.
Mayor, just as a point of clarification, I don't believe we've estimated number of hours going into this. We've talked about 90 days plus or minus getting through the end of October. There are actually a number of staff, and depending on the issues that come up, there could be legal analysis involved and so forth. So not knowing exactly all the issues yet, we have not honed in on a number of hours. Across all these different departments, it's likely to be much more than that over a 3-month span. But again, we
I
haven't
didn't
gotten
think
into
you
all the
said
work yet.
3 months. I didn't understand you to have said 3 months. I thought it was 3 weeks. So
Sorry.
I thought you said it's weeks, not months, when you were talking to us originally.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I can clarify that. The delays in the other work programs are likely to be in weeks, not months. So if something flips back one commission meeting to the next, that's a 2-week delay because this work is being fit in. So it's in weeks, not in several months back on all these other items.
The delay is in weeks and not months, but the actual staff time could be in months. Okay.
Yes, it's multiple people spending a few to many hours on different components of this.
All right.
I would say thank you, Mayor. I was going to say we're going to be off for a month, during the break. So I wonder if we could say 1 month. So by the time we come back, maybe that's a good portent.
Can I just weigh in? I mean, I agree that the council will be off, but there will be a number of staff on vacation as well. So I just want to put that out there for consideration.
Councilmember Zahn, you had a comment?
Yeah, I did, because as I'm listening to the comments about the fact that staff is already overburdened with the work that we have at hand, and what Patience Malaba gave in public testimony about not reinventing the wheel and wanting to work in partnership with us to develop a compilation of best practices, whether we really should be having staff do the outreach to those that know the most about best practices, to be doing more of this work of compilation versus staff spending a lot of time. So I keep thinking about the fact that, it seems like we're asking staff to do something that the community that's really focused on this work would be able to provide us the most information. So I just wonder whether this is the best use of staff time, or if the way that this motion is framed actually would have staff do that outreach to be the most effective in getting back these best practices in these two areas.
Well, in my field of work, best practices means you're looking at research of what's already been established as successful and as a best practice. It doesn't mean you are creating the best practice. So it's looking at what has been successful, what's considered, the gold standard, and what would that look like for Bellevue to do. So it's kind of reviewing what the work that's already been done and choosing what would be good for Bellevue. So I don't see staff as creating these these best practices. I mean, that'd be a tremendous amount of work. So
yes, I guess my question is, has someone else already done this work of collecting this? And do we know that?
Councilmember Zahn, I think there are a number of groups that have done research on the continuum of housing and continuum of care. And yes, there are undoubtedly a variety of different potential best practices that have been published out there. The key would be to thread the needle and look at those and how applicable they are to Bellevue and what we already regulate and what we don't. And then, having a chance for the council to kick around, do you want to add regulations or not? And for what specific outcomes? And that would be your November conversation if you chose to take this up tonight.
Okay, and the timing is such that we need to do this now, because I was also thinking about the fact that the Evans School is looking for projects from organizations for their students to work on. And I just keep thinking about what staff should be working on in the city and how burdened they are.
I don't think it's up to us to tell staff how to do this work. I think it's up to us to direct whether we want them to do the work, and they can determine whether they want to use interns or the Evans School or whatever. But they're looking for us for direction tonight if they even want to pursue this information, however they decide to do it. So Councilmember Lee, you had your hand up. Councilmember Stokes, did you have your hand up as well, or?
Maybe.
Okay, so I'll go with Councilmember Lee.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. I'd like to make a proposed amendment to Councilmember Robertson's motion. I'd like to include best practices to look at safety and security plans.
Is there a second? Not hearing one, that motion drops. Councilmember Stokes.
Well, I just think actually we spent probably more time tonight.
I don't need a critique on the process. I'm wondering if you have
I'm ready to vote on it. Let's go.
Okay, let's go. Call for the vote then.
Do we know what we're voting for?
We have a motion on the table. Do you want to read it again, Councilmember Robertson?
I would be happy to. I move to direct staff to initiate work to evaluate best practices for supportive housing, specifically evaluating on-site supportive services based on best practices for populations served and for neighborhood outreach, engagement, and relationship building, and to bring these items back to council for discussion and potential future implementation.
Okay, all those in favor, raise your hand. All those opposed, raise your hand. Any abstentions? Okay, we got that. I believe that passes.
Could you tell us what's the count?
4-3, I believe.
Mayor, we need an audible.
Okay, so let's go ahead and do it audibly and with our hands up. All those in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
All those opposed say nay.
Nay.
And no abstentions. Okay, thank you. All right. We are on to the consent calendar. Is there a motion to approve the consent calendar?
I move to approve the consent calendar.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, next up we have 2 public hearings. Mr. Miyake, would you like to introduce the first one?
Sure, Mayor. As you mentioned, we have 2 public hearings in front of you this evening. The first one is the public hearing on Ordinance 6585 regarding permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, emergency housing, and emergency shelter. And just by way of background, Ordinance number 6585 was adopted on July 12th, imposing an interim official control to 1, allow permanent supportive housing and transitional housing in all land use districts where residential uses and hotel motels are allowed, and 2, allow homeless services uses in all land use districts where hotels and motels are allowed. The interim official control was adopted in response to the recent state legislation, House Bill 1220, passed and signed by the governor. And joining us this evening for a brief staff report are Mike Brennan, the director, as well as Trisna Tanis, consulting attorney, Caleb Miller, senior planner, all of from Development Services. They are also joined by Mac McFarland, assistant city attorney from the city attorney's office. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mike Brennan to set up the report this evening. Mike?
Thank you, Ms. Miyake. As the city manager said, we are here this evening for the public hearing. It's required for the interim control, the interim official control, which are land use code amendments. This evening, after the completion of the public hearing, we will be asking, next slide, please. We will be asking the council to initiate the permanent regulation, sending this to the Planning Commission, which will include study sessions, a public hearing, and then return to council with a Planning Commission recommendation for adoption of permanent regulations at a later date. So I'll hand it over to Trisna and Caleb Miller, who can provide additional background information prior to the public hearing. Trisna?
Great. Thank you, Mike. Good evening, Mayor Robinson, Deputy Mayor Newenhouse, and council members. For our brief staff report tonight, we will begin by explaining the objective of the ISC ordinance number 6585 and explain the components of the ordinance and close with the description about the next steps for the LUCA. So as you may recall, in the past legislative session, the state legislature passed and the governor signed into law House Bill 1220. This bill became effective on July 25th. And in essence, the bill requires cities to allow permanent supportive housing and transitional housing in all land use districts where residential and hotels and motel uses are allowed, and emergency housing and emergency shelter in all land use districts where hotels and motels are allowed. The Interim Official Control, or IOC, Council adopted that on July 12th, was designed to quickly and narrowly bring the city's land use regulations to immediate compliance with these new state mandates. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Caleb to go through the components of the LUCA. Caleb?
Thank you, Trisna, and good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and council members. Before we go into the amendments for this IOC, I just wanted to go through the different housing types addressed under HB 1220. On the left, you have permanent supportive housing and transitional housing. These are the longer term interventions, really more permanent basis for residency. Permanent supportive housing, it implies permanent residency, and then transitional housing supportive services are provided to transition people into more independent living arrangements. On the right are emergency housing and emergency shelter. These are going to be your shorter term interventions, really more intended to address basic daily needs before transitioning tenants into more permanent living arrangements, such as permanent supportive housing. Both emergency housing and emergency shelter fit fairly well under the existing framework of homeless services uses in the land use code. So with that in mind, next slide, please, Trisna. So the amendments in this IOC Ordinance 6585, there are two main components. The first is with the land use tables in the land use code. New footnotes are being included to say permanent supportive housing and transitional housing are allowed where residential and hotel motel uses are allowed. Further, homeless services uses generally were allowed in all zones where hotels and motels were allowed as required by HB 1220, except for two districts, the neighborhood mixed use and the office and limited business open space. So the land use tables for those two districts have been updated to allow homeless services uses. That said, they are still subject to conditional use permit approval, as well as supplemental approval criteria for those uses under 2020-455C. Speaking of which, the second component of amendments will be to amend the homeless services uses definition to clarify that they do include emergency housing and emergency shelter, which I mentioned previously. Next slide, please. In terms of the process for the IOC, tonight's public hearing is within the 60 days required for an IOC. It is effective for 6 months following the date of adoption, so it does expire on January 12th of 2022. The EBCC will be holding their public hearing and action on the IOC tomorrow evening, August 3rd. And then finally, staff does anticipate development of permanent regulations through the LUCA process, which we will be asking council to initiate this evening. And so with that in mind, next slide, please, Trisna. Staff does recommend holding the public hearing tonight on ordinance number 6585, and then following the public hearing, initiate and provide direction on the land use code amendment process. With that, I'll pass it back to you, Mayor.
So can you clarify for us what freedom we have, whether we choose to adopt or not adopt state law, and what the implications are for a city like Bellevue if we choose not to adopt state law?
So that's probably a question that's best handled through the city attorney's office. I don't know if they're prepared to respond to that question this evening or would need to follow up later. I believe we've got Matt McFarland on the call this evening from the city attorney's office. Matt, would you like to respond?
Well, certainly the state law requirement went into effect in July with respect to the permanent and supportive housing. So if the city were not to bring its code into compliance as of last month, then the city would be out of compliance with state law. With respect to the emergency housing and the permanent indoor shelter components, even though the 1220 state law went into effect in July, the requirement to bring the city into compliance for those two items actually goes into effect in September of this year, right after council gets back from the break. So staff did fold all four of these uses into the interim official control to try to bring the city into immediate compliance by the July deadline. And I think council has recognized also that with respect to the emergency housing and the indoor emergency shelter, what we've done with the interim official control is regulate those as homeless services uses. So we felt like that was a regulatory scheme that council already had in place through our homeless services uses, Luca, so that these two uses fit relatively squarely within that land use code section already. But if the city were not to proceed with this, the council's already adopted this interim official control. But if the city were not to maintain this interim official control while we process the permanent land use code amendment, then the city would not be in compliance with state law.
What happens when you're not in compliance with state law? I'm not asking for myself. I'm asking for the community who wants to know this.
Well, the city's current land use code could be subject to legal challenge.
Oh, so does that cost us a lot of money? I mean, what can you help us understand? I mean, whether philosophically we agree with it or not, why is it important to be in compliance with state law?
Well, as the city's land use attorney, I do think it's important for the city to have a lawful land use code whenever possible, particularly when the state has mandated certain requirements go into local code. With respect to what could actually happen as far as the legal challenge is concerned, it would be somewhat speculative for me to guess what may or may not happen, but I can assure you that the city would be well served by bringing its land use code into compliance with state law.
Okay, thank you for that recommendation. So let's go ahead and open the public hearing. Is there a motion to open the public hearing?
I move to open the public hearing.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, do we have anybody signed up for public comment?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. There are 2 individuals signed up for this particular public hearing. And the first speaker is Nancy Whitaker. Ms. Whitaker, can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Your time begins now.
Okay, hi, my name's Nancy Whitaker. I live at 1924 160th Avenue Northeast in Bellevue, and I'm representing a group of neighbors from Northeast Bellevue. And we just have some concerns about some of these homeless facilities that would be brought into Bellevue, into our neighborhoods. We're already experiencing that with one that is in Redmond technically, but is right next door to us, the Silver Cloud. But regarding ones in Bellevue, we just want you to consider some things about how it might affect neighbors. One thing is to consider whether it would differentiate between the reasons that people are homeless. Lots of reasons for people to be homeless: mental illness, poverty or job loss, or different kinds of addiction, criminal activity, that kind of thing. And so we just want to caution that certain locations might not be so good depending on the clientele, the type of homeless issues. The Silver Cloud Hotel could be a great location for homeless families, but it happens to be really close to a KinderCare and 3 different public schools, which makes us concerned about it being possibly a place where there would be people that have addictions or mental illness. Another thing that we'd like you to consider is what type of support would be provided to these various types of homeless people, and will they have buy-in to the services that they're able to access? Would these particular shelters offer wraparound services and social workers? Can these services be required as a condition for people to live there? What time of day or night would the services be available, and what kind of COVID protections would be put in place at these facilities? And what kinds of activities would the people living there be doing during the day? We're concerned about it. Will there be panhandling near key intersections that might increase traffic hazards? So just some things to consider. And we would also like you to think about what kind of support would be going to the neighborhoods. Would there be an additional police presence? Would neighbors, especially more vulnerable populations like the elderly folks and disabled neighbors, feel safe walking around their neighborhood, going to the grocery store, riding the buses? Will these kind of people become targets of crime? Who's going to clean up the used needles? And will local stores need to hire additional security to make sure that their parking lots are safe? We just want you to consider what would be the ultimate goal of this program. Are we merely trying to put a roof over people's heads, or are we going to treat them, give them counseling and guidance, and try to get them back on their own feet? How will the City of Bellevue work to ensure that these questions are considered and addressed in order to protect the Bellevue residents who live near these facilities? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Whitaker. The next speaker on the list is Emmanuel Solis. Mr. Solis, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Your time begins now.
Hi, this is Emmanuel Solis. I'm a Bellevue resident at 2447 161st Avenue Northeast. I live a few blocks from the former Silver Cloud Hotel, recently purchased by King County and now being converted into permanent housing for the chronically homeless. I just spent the last 2 hours finally learning the details about this project and how King County and Redmond are working together on that property. Given that the property is across the street from the residential housing in Bellevue, it was very disappointing to learn about this significant event from communities from the city of Redmond and not Bellevue. It seems like the city of Bellevue again did not engage with other neighbor cities, as others have commented earlier, to ensure that Bellevue residents are informed. This is a classical example of what happens when actions and decisions come first and details and information are coming later. The result is a lot of uncertainty and therefore fear from the community. When I see staff's comments on how this IOC amendment, quote, enhances the public health, safety, and welfare because it intends to address the root cause of homelessness, end quote, and when staff says that the amendment is, quote, not contrary to the interest of citizens and property owners of the city of Bellevue, because the amendment allows for additional opportunities to cite new supportive housing and shelter programs that can assist in combating the homelessness crisis in the region, end quote. I have to only partially agree, as this is only looking at the health and safety part of the population. The interests of current property owners are not acknowledged in this statement. I'm not saying that this is an argument to reject these changes, but when the argument for support and information only addresses a small fraction of the residents with a vision but not the details on the implementation, it is very difficult to have current residents behind these changes. No one thinks that homelessness is a good thing, and I applaud the work that Council is trying to do to address this community crisis and comply with the state law. I would like to ask that the city thinks through the details for implementing and communicating the state law so that we maximize the benefit for both current and future residents using this type of housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Solis. At this point, that is the end of our pre-registered list for this public hearing. If there's anyone else connected to this meeting who would like to make a comment during this public hearing, please use the raise hand function or *9 if you're connected with a phone. Mayor, I do see one hand, and it looks to be Ms. Bluma, Els Bluma. Can you hear me? Ms. Bluma, can you hear me? Ms. Bluma, can you hear me? It appears she must be having an audio connection issue. I do not see any other hands raised. Ms. Bluma, if you can hear me, you can email your comments to the council at council@bellevuelaw.gov. And Mayor, I do not see any additional hands raised.
Okay, thank you. Is there a motion to close the public hearing?
I move to close the public hearing.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, this is open for discussion. I'll see if anybody raises their hand. We don't have to discuss everything that comes before us, but certainly welcome to if anybody has any comments or questions. Councilmember Robertson and then Councilmember Stokes.
Well, I supported adopting the interim official control because we need to comply with state law. I would encourage anyone who has opinions about the permanent regulations to share their opinions with the Planning Commission, because they're the ones that are going to be drafting the permanent regulations, which will eventually make their way back to us. So that's about all. Thanks.
Councilmember Stokes.
Yeah, I would agree with Councilmember Robertson's comments. And I would like to, somewhere along the way, I think it would really be helpful if we could get a legal opinion that basically, that we can tell the public and we can understand what, not complying with the state law has, because there are implications. And I know it's complex, but it would really help in the conversations because, it's not something we do all the time, and I think it would just be helpful to have, have an informed community. And as a lawyer, I know that's a difficult thing to do, but I think it would help us a lot. Thank you.
I agree as well. Any other comments or questions? Okay, is there a motion, Deputy Mayor?
Actually, Mayor, I don't believe we need a motion for this. I think staff will work with the Planning Commission to move this forward, but I can provide a motion if you like.
I was thinking of a motion to initiate and provide direction regarding the processing of the permanent LUCA.
Okay. I move to direct staff to initiate the processing of the permanent land use code amendment.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, thank you. Let's see, let's go to the next one. Mr. Miyake, could you introduce the next one, please?
Sure, Mayor. The second public hearing this evening is regarding Ordinance 6586, which imposes an interim official control to remove residential occupancy limits from the Land Use Code. By way of background, Ordinance 6586 imposed interim official control to remove all residential occupancy limits from the Land Use Code in response to recent state legislation, in particular, Senate Bill 5235, which addressed local authority to regulate the number of occupants in a dwelling unit. Per the Growth Management Act, public hearing is required within 60 days of the ILC adoption. Joining us this evening again is Mike Brennan and Trisna Tanis and Caleb Miller, all from the Development Services, as well as they're accompanied by Mac Farland, Assistant City Attorney of the City Attorney's Office. And I'll go and turn it over to Mike to open this up. Mike?
Thank you again, Mr. Miyake. The process is simply a repeat of the last public hearing. Again, we will be asking the council to hold a public hearing on the interim official control, and following that public hearing, direct staff to work with the Planning Commission to initiate the permanent land use code through the LUCA process. Again, we have a brief staff report this evening on this code amendment, and I'll hand it over to Trisna Tanis to continue the presentation. Trisna.
Great, thank you, Mike. Good evening again, everyone. As Mike noted, just like the item before, this is a pretty short staff report tonight. We'll start with an explanation of the objective of this particular IOC ordinance, 6586. We'll explain the components of the ordinance. We will also be describing some code provisions that are already in place and would not change, that we hope will be helpful to provide the larger context of regulations that are applicable to housing units in the city. And we'll close with a description about next steps for the LUCA. So the objective for the IOC ordinance, as noted earlier in this past legislative session, in addition to House Bill 1220 that you just heard about, The state legislature also passed and the governor signed into law Senate Bill 5235. It also became effective on July 25th. And at that point, the provisions of the bill were codified in a new section in Chapter 35A21 of the RCW. This particular section contains provisions affecting all code cities, which Bellevue is one of. And this section in Chapter 35A21 addresses local authority to regulate the number of occupants in a dwelling unit. The objective of the IOC, as you heard earlier, is to bring the city's land use regulations into immediate compliance with this new state law. So should council initiate and provide direction after the public hearing for a LUCA, staff is planning on developing permanent regulations to be processed by the Planning Commission. I'm going to now turn the presentation over to Caleb Miller for the rest of staff's report. Caleb?
Thank you, Trisna. So now I'll go through the components of the interim official control. Primarily, the amendments will amend the family definition, as you see here, to one or more persons residing in a dwelling and operating as a single housekeeping unit. The definition for single housekeeping unit in the land use code was also amended to remove the requirement for a single lease in response to SB 5235, as well as clarifying that single housekeeping units are not applicable for transient lodging situations. So as an example of how the family definition governs the occupancy of a single family home, it basically means for a single family dwelling, one family operating as a single housekeeping unit may reside within that building. Next slide, please. Additional amendments, the rooming house definition was amended to basically clarify that any non-owner occupied dwelling that is rented on an individual room basis is considered a rooming house. Further, specific housing types had their own occupancy limits, namely accessory dwelling units were limited based on the family definition of no more than 4 unrelated people. And rooming houses also had a specific occupancy limit of no more than 5 tenants at any one time. I will note that the IOC does maintain the maximum of 4 rooms being rented for a rooming house. Next slide, please. As Tristan noted, there are some codes in place that are not being amended as part of this IOC and that will stay in place. First of all, transient lodging, such as Airbnb, VRBO, and other apps like that. They are only allowed in owner-occupied homes and with a home occupation permit. And with that, I'll also note that the accessory dwelling units are also not allowed to have transient lodging situations as well. So that will remain in place. Further, rooming houses are still prohibited in single-family land use districts. They are only allowed in multifamily and mixed use, and I believe it's just multifamily mixed use. And then finally, traffic, parking, noise, and nuisance codes are still in effect. Any concerns that are that people might have based on those codes can still be submitted to the Bellevue Police Department, as well as through the My Bellevue app to our code compliance team for any violations to be reported. Next slide, please. Finally, in terms of the process for the IOC, again, tonight's public hearing is within the required 60 days for an IOC. It will be effective for 6 months following the date of adoption, so January 12th, 2022. And just like the 1220 IOC, EBCC will be holding their public hearing and action on this tomorrow evening, August 3rd. And finally, staff does anticipate the permanent regulations will be developed through the LUCA process, following generally the similar timeline of the other IOC we discussed this evening. Next slide, please. And with that in mind, staff does recommend holding the public hearing on ordinance number 6586, and then following the public hearing, initiating and providing direction on the land use code amendment. Thank you. Back to you, Mayor.
All right, thank you. Is there a motion to open the public hearing?
I move to open the public hearing.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay. City Clerk, do we have anybody signed up for comment?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. There's one individual signed up for this public hearing, and that is Russ Paravecchio. And Mr. Paravecchio, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Your time begins now.
I'm Dr. Russ Paravecchio. I live at 2495 158th Place, Northeast Bellevue. My talk is centered on finding out what is Bellevue's plan to regulate the increased density in residential neighborhoods, which would follow implementation of Ordinance 6586. What is your plan to establish parameters regarding how many people, related or unrelated, can live in a certain square footage residence? Surely there must be a finite number, since it just can't be unlimited. What is your plan to ensure these houses are going to be brought up to and maintained at current safety and fire code standards? What is your plan to monitor compliance? What is your plan to implement a safety inspection program for rental and boarding houses? Do you plan something similar to that of the city of Seattle? Since more people translate to a larger demand on our infrastructure, what is your plan for ensuring adequate water, gas, and sewage usage? Incidentally, I personally know when I tried to add a one-room bedroom addition to my house, the city demanded I dig up and increase the size of my sewer line from the house to the street. Doesn't bedrooming additional people into the same structure translate into essentially the same requirement? What is the plan to ensure the overall electric grid? Will there be inspections to ensure each home's electrical panel can handle the additional electronics of additional people? What limits exist or need to be modified to accommodate more parked cars on the street for such increased capacity houses? Remember, many of our Bellevue streets don't have sidewalks, and residents have to walk in the street to take an evening stroll. What's the plan to accommodate increased garbage and sanitation needs? What is your plan to proactively deal with the known increase in conflict with increased density? Will this require additional police, fire, and emergency services? If increased living density promotes greater transmission of contagious disease, what's your proactive plan to deal with this? What's the plan to deal with the impact on both traffic and emergency services? I've spoken both to this council and the Transportation Commission regarding traffic and safety issues for our mere 3 lifelines in and out of Northeast Bellevue, and can only shudder at seeing one more potential insult to this critically important faction of our existence. What is your plan for regulating how many pets can be housed in a dwelling? How many dogs, cats, etc. can share the yard? Will these residents be vested in our communities? If so, what's the plan to facilitate how these individuals will feel a sense of belonging and assimilate to the community? Saying yes to expansion does not exonerate Bellevue from merely hoping such implementation will lead to improvement. It must be preceded by well-considered planning so that the increased density does not result in a decrease in quality of life for both new and existing residents. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Paravecchio. At this point, I would ask if there is anyone else connected to this meeting who would like to make comment to the City Council. Please use the raise hand function or *9 if you're connected with a phone. Mayor, I do not see any additional hands raised.
Okay, thank you. Is there a motion to close the public hearing?
I move to close the public hearing.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, so if anybody has questions or comments, please raise your hand. I see Councilmember Robertson and then Deputy Mayor Newhouse. Go ahead, Councilmember Robertson.
Thank you. So I obviously support the IOC bringing us into compliance with the code. The engrossed substitute Senate Bill 5235, which is the basis for this, allows lawful limits on occupant load per square foot or generally applicable health and safety provisions as established by applicable building code or city ordinance. And when we were looking at this before, I had asked our staff whether we had an occupancy limit in residential zones, and the answer was no, we don't. So in my day job as an attorney for other cities, we're all doing these ordinances to bring their codes into compliance. And so I started digging into this issue. And the International Property Maintenance Code, which is Bellevue has not adopted, but is on our work plan to look at adopting, does have in section 404 occupancy limitations for residential, which makes sure that there's health and safety things considered. So I'm not asking the council to make a motion to direct that be looked at, but I wanted to raise it so that staff could consider whether that type of occupancy limitation would be appropriate, since we're losing one occupancy type of regulation, but we still can do things for health and safety. Because the last thing I want to see is have a residential unit, whether it's multifamily, an ADU, or a home or a single family home, overloaded with so many people that it creates a health and safety or fire hazard. So just a comment from me to staff that, because I really dug into this, there really is not a lot that has occupancy limits for residential, except for the International Property Maintenance Code. So there might be more, but that's the one I found. So I just wanted to give that comment on the record to staff so that they can consider it when they're bringing the permanent regulations to the Planning Commission. If the Planning Commission is asking about other ways to do occupation, that's just one way that we can legally do it under the new state law. So, but otherwise I support initiating the work, sending it to Planning Commission. Thanks.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, similar comments as Councilmember Robertson. I support moving this, to the next step here, and support getting in compliance with the state. Similar comments. I thank Russ as well during his comments on this Senate Bill 5235, and I wish some of those questions would have been asked at that time down in Olympia. But it is what it is, and here we are, and let's move forward in the process. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Councilmember Stokes.
Yeah, I agree with the comments of my colleagues there on this. That might help us kind of work with this. And it is what it is, as we say. I did have a question again on legal question in a sense. I understand that EBCC is going to have a hearing or consideration of this, but does EBCC have any legal significance in this decision making? I mean, EBCC can't make a contrary decision by itself. Is that correct?
Can I refer that to either Nick Melosinos, our Deputy City Attorney, or to Matt?
Okay.
Yes.
Nick?
Sure. So the EBCC is set to hear this tomorrow, and they would be able to vote on it. And then we would have to evaluate it to see what they would do and what they had done in order to see if they're voting in accordance with what state law is requiring, or if they voted a different way and voted it down. So then we would have to evaluate what they did, and then we would be providing additional advice to the council at that time.
Okay.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, Deputy Mayor, could you make a motion, please?
Certainly, I move to direct staff to initiate the processing of the Permanent Land Use Code Amendment Ordinance 6586.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that passes. So it's 8:01. We will resume at 8:11. Take a little break.
Okay.
So next we're into some study session items. Mr. Miyake, would you like to introduce the first one?
Sure, Mayor and council members. The study session topic on your agenda this evening is a briefing by King County on the Washington Department of Ecology draft Puget Sound Nutrient General Permit. Specifically, King County is requesting support from local sewer agencies regarding its concern with ecology's new draft Puget Sound Nutrient Permit. Tonight, staff is seeking council direction on whether to support King County's request by submitting a letter to Ecology outlining the city's concerns with respect to the draft permit. A draft letter has been included in your packet for this evening. Joining us this evening is Nav Otol, our director of our utilities department, and she is here to introduce the topic as well as our guest. Nav?
Thank you, Mr. Miyake. I hope everyone can hear me. Good evening, Mayor Robinson, Deputy Mayor Newhouse, and council members. Tonight, King County Wastewater Treatment Division Director Cameron Gurral and his staff are here to present an overview of the MPDS permit and share their concerns about proposed new permit requirements, which would apply to county's wastewater treatment plant operations. Now, although Bellevue does not own wastewater treatment plants, we contract with King County for wastewater treatment services. Payments to King County at over $36 million a year make up almost 2/3 of the utility's annual expenses and are the single largest cost driver for Bellevue sewer utility customers. Treatment costs are already high. Based on the initial cost estimates provided by King County, the permit has the potential to drive significant rate increases for Bellevue sewer customers. So this is an important issue for Bellevue sewer customers. After the county's presentation, we will be seeking your direction on whether Bellevue should support King County by submitting a comment letter to Ecology, sharing the city's concerns about the permit. I'd like to now turn it over to Director Gurral to share his thoughts.
Thank you very much, Ms. Otal. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for the time here tonight. It's nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces at Bellevue. I want to thank Councilmember Lee for serving on our Regional Water Quality Committee, helps provide guidance for our division. I thought Director Otal's introduction was spot on. This is a very important subject, and we do appreciate your time here tonight. We're going to keep our presentation very short so that we can answer your questions. And we did appreciate seeing your agenda, Bill, and your draft letter in your agenda packet here tonight. I think those are well done, and I would encourage the council's strong consideration of sending a letter to express Bellevue's points of view in this very important process. With me tonight is Rebecca Singer. She's our section manager for resource recovery. She's been running point for our division on this nutrient issue. She'll walk through a few slides. We also have Sharman Heron from our Government Relations Office, who maintains good relations with the city in a number of ways. So with that, I'll ask Rebecca to start her presentation and I believe share her screen.
Thank you for having us here today. I really appreciate that. And like it was said, this is the draft Puget Sound Nutrient General Permit, and it will work in coordination with the NPDS permit. So it is separate from that, but it is supposed to work in coordination with. Now, I understand that you have a copy of this presentation. So tonight, for the sake of time, I'm only going to go through a portion of it, and I'm going to pick up on the key highlights of it. So with that, we're going to get right into this. So this particular permit, it is going to ask a lot of 58 of our utilities around this, around our region. And those 58 utilities are going to have to adhere to specific requirements. Part of it will be to initiate some planning efforts to reduce nitrogen from their effluent. And in doing so, Ecology is asking us to look at source control. So why do I mention source control? Well, the 3 points of source control that they have mentioned to us is that they'd like us to manage septage, so reduce the amount of septage that we are receiving, to look at industrial and commercial treatment, so maybe put in pre-treatment at any industrial or commercial discharger, and to evaluate how we can reduce nitrogen coming from multifamily or dense housing communities. All of these things are going to require more than a utility or what we are allowed to do. It's going to require a lot of land use management, as well as planners, as well as city management to better understand where these sources of nitrogen are coming from, but more important, to better manage the septage and sewage that is coming into our facility. We cannot ask our septage management haulers to stop bringing us septage. Where would they take it? We are a central point for them to discharge that, as well as multifamily and dense housing communities. We cannot ask residents to stop flushing the toilet. They're asking for us to look at ways of diverting the nitrogen that is coming from these dense housing communities. And the only way to do that is source separation. So basically separating the solids from the liquids. So with this permit, King County has looked to determine where are we as far as our limit. They are giving us a specific limit or threshold that we have to maintain for our nitrogen effluent. And as we looked at our projections, we are ready to exceed this limit in this coming year. So by the time they issue this permit, we will already be out of compliance and be required to initiate nitrogen implementation into our planning process. It's also going to require us to implement a lot of capital and operating dollars in order to achieve that. Now, if we're out of compliance 2 years in a row, we will automatically have to reduce our nitrogen by 10%. And this is very significant. That is a significant capital investment into our infrastructure and planning. So economic-wise, our rates are set to double just to maintain our current system. If we add nitrogen on top of that, our rates are going to increase even further. And one of the things that has some concern for us is that the Department of Ecology decided that according to the WAC, they were not required to do an economic analysis on the impact that this permit would have on the communities around. The WAC specifies small businesses and, sorry about that. Didn't know if you were unable to see those. The WAC specifies small businesses. And so what they say is that this will not impact any small business. Therefore, they were not required to do an economic analysis. However, small businesses in all of our communities are going to have to continue to pay for this. They're not out of the weeds. Those septic haulers, again, they're small businesses. They will be impacted by this. Any industry or commercial business is going to be impacted if we require them to put in pretreatment prior. And then any, of course, development as we move forward, if we have to figure out ways of mitigating the amount of nitrogen being put into our system from housing communities, again, this is going to have an economic impact. So what is King County's recommending? Well, since we have a lot of other high expense gray infrastructure going in, such as additional CSO control, as well as trying to maintain our assets at our current rate or even just similar rates, adding in the added cost of nitrogen removal, we feel that there's other alternatives to meeting this compliance. One of the things that we have found is that the nitrogen is affecting shallow embayments. And those shallow embayments, such as Bud Inlet or Penn Cove, have unique ecosystems that can be managed independently, so place-based. So prior to putting in any additional gray infrastructure, we are hoping that we can go to those specific spots and address the problem where they're at, rather than implementing additional nitrogen removal. And are you seeing my screen or not? You are? Great.
This is the city clerk. I had to take over presentation because you weren't in presentation mode. If you just let me know when you want to advance the slide and to what slide, I'll advance it for you.
Oh, fantastic. I apologize. I'm actually on slide 9. So what we'd like is for the science, we want to get the science right. Ecology hasn't completed their scientific review. They have not completed their nutrient management plan, and they're issuing this permit in advance of completing their portion of the work. And again, we would like to go to where the problem is. We'd like to reduce runoff from farmlands and urban landscapes, or fix failing septic systems so that we can improve these shallow embayments that the Department of Ecology is considered impaired due to low dissolved oxygen or increases in nitrogen. Go ahead and move to slide 10, which should be the next one. So what happens after comments are made? So King County will be submitting their comments on the due date of August 16th. From there, Ecology must prepare a response to comment. They have already said that they will take about 3 months to put together their comment document. This puts them in about mid-November. From there, they plan to issue the final permit on December 1st of 2021. And it takes 30 days before it's implemented or effective. So that puts a date of January 1st of 2022. During the period of time between December and January, there is a 30-day appeal period in which anyone can appeal this process. Anyone with standing can appeal this process. And if you could go on to the next slide, please. So for any additional information, we can You can find that at the Department of Ecology's website, and I've included that web link here. If you want to make comments, you can either submit them online or send them in writing to Eleanor Ott. Additionally, Cameron and I are available for any comments or questions that you'd like to have clarified or any additional information that you are looking for. And with that, I would like to conclude or answer any questions that you may have. I apologize for the speedy run through.
Mayor, we can't hear
Mayor, I
you.
believe you're on mute.
Thank you. So thank you for the presentation. And I can see everybody. Does anybody have a comment or question? I see Councilmember Robertson and Councilmember Lee. Go ahead, Councilmember Robertson.
Thank you so much, Rebecca and Cameron, for coming tonight. I think this is such an important issue. I've been following this issue for over a year, and I'm very, very concerned with ecology's approach. The science or the regulation now, science later, regulation now, plan later, regulation now, and economic analysis later is really not the way we should do things in the state of Washington. So I'm very, very concerned. I have a couple of comments and then I have a couple of questions, well more than there's time for tonight. So I'll try to limit it to just 3. One of the things that I've seen in the data is that ecology is wanting to have the wastewater treatment facilities deal with this issue, but the nutrient loads, AKA the nitrogen, the vast majority, 91%, come from natural sources, not from wastewater or effluent discharges, not even from stormwater runoff and failing septic systems. So the regulation on the permit really only deals with that 9%. And according to what I've read, if we spend, what was the number? $158 billion retrofitting, was that the right number? Retrofitting all of the different wastewater treatment facilities on Puget Sound will address 7%, which is really cost benefit analysis may not really make a lot of sense. So my concerns are in threefold, and I'd like to see the letter, which is really important for Bellevue to weigh in. And not only does it let ecology know where we're going, but it gives us standing should we want to join an appeal later. I'd like to see it expanded a little bit more. And I know my colleagues got a little document from me on these issues. So there's 3 main issues. One is, of course, the sources of nitrogen in Puget Sound and looking at the scientific evidence. The second issue is the affordability of the fix. Is the fix going to do anything or do enough? How affordable is it to the region? And the third issue, which wasn't in the city's draft letter, is the impact on growth. And I'm going to start with that because the city council's been talking a lot about growth. And we actually advocated for King County to assign us 35,000 new housing units, 70,000 jobs for growth by 2044. My understanding, and this will be the question for Bellevue or King County staff. My understanding is if this goes forward, the wastewater treatment facilities, most of the wastewater treatment facilities, including the ones in King County, will automatically be out of compliance unless they start spending a whole lot of money to grow, filter, add another bright water, et cetera. And if we run out of, if we're out of compliance, then one of the main documents, the first documents people get when they pull a permit is a sewer availability letter. You have to have it to get a permit. If we don't have any capacity in our wastewater treatment facilities, people can't get permits and we can't grow as we are expected to do. And it's really you could grow in the rural area where there's septic systems, but you couldn't grow in the urban area where there's sewer systems. So my question for staff is, if this standard is included in the general permit, is it your expectation that King County will deny any requests to confirm sewer availability? And how will that impact Bellevue and the county's abilities to comply with GMA? So that's question number 1.
This is Cameron. I'll defer if city staff want to take a first stab at that, but I have a short answer I can offer.
Go ahead, Cameron.
I don't think we're there yet to specifically answer your question, though I think it's a very good one, council member. And one of the observations that we made to Ecology at their public workshop, and they had a verbal opportunity to offer comments, is that as it stands, this proposed regulation would appear to conflict with other state goals. And I think that is something that it does fall to the state as a responsibility to reconcile and harmonize across a variety of different goals and responsibilities that they ask cities and counties to comply with. So we've identified that same kind of issue that you're identifying here, which is you're trying to comply with GMA, densify, provide the urban services so that we don't promote sprawl. That is a fundamental goal here. And Bellevue has done yeoman's work towards that, that I've observed in my career. And we don't want to put that at risk, it seems to me, with something like this that would call into question the ability to provide sewer service. I won't specifically answer your question as to whether we would not, be able to provide treatment services. It's a duty that we have, but I do think it calls into question that conflict. So I think you're right to raise it, and I would encourage you to consider that for your letter.
Thank you. So with regard to, I guess I'll leave the scientific issue alone. I've already commented on that. With regard to affordability, what are these are my last two questions. What are the
Councilmember Robertson, can I cut in here for just a minute and let some other people have a chance and then get back to you?
I thought I got 3 questions.
Well, you've taken quite a bit of time, and so I'm going to let you come back around and ask the next 2 questions. But maybe nobody else has a question here. And what's up here is we have a draft letter that's in our packet, and we're discussing whether or not we want to approve that to be sent or add Councilmember Robertson's additions to it, so that she's proposing here. So is there anybody else has a comment or a question on this, or shall we? Okay, Councilmember Lee, I think you were next, and then Councilmember Stokes.
Thank you. Well, welcome, Director Cameron and Rebecca. As a member of the SCA's WQR Regional Water Quality Committee, we have been talking about this a lot, and I think it's very crucial time to bring this to the attention of the City Council. As indicated, also the question Councilmember Robertson asked is just one aspect of it. And this one in particular, we're already talking about doubling our rate by 2030. And this is, I believe, it's a very alarming number and has a great impact on the ratepayers, like Nav was talking about. This is just the tip of the iceberg. At the committee, we're talking about clean water plan, we're talking about waste treatment plans, and we're talking about asset management. And all these have tremendous financial implications, including we're even talking about a new waste treatment plant. So I think it's important. We have many issues we can spend lots of time talking about. Again, the King County Committee has been spending the last number of years. And so I think the timing is good. We need to begin educating the City Council the implication of the rate step of ratepayers to be facing, unless we grab hold of it early on, starting with the Department of Ecology and various other considerations. So I think this is a great, SCA is very much involved. They're very interested because it impacts all of us. So I appreciate King County staff is coming to our cities and telling us and giving us a first glimpse of the education. And I highly recommend, we need to approve the letter and get the attention of DOE, begin the process. But more importantly, I think it's an opportunity for us to educate ourselves so we don't get surprised.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember Lee. Councilmember Stokes.
Councilmember Stokes, you're on mute.
And And that was the best part of what I was going to say.
Go ahead.
Anyhow, no, I really appreciate my comments by my colleagues and the presentation. I missed it a little bit at the first there. Of course, we've been looking at it from a lot of different angles, so it's good to have this perspective. The Regional Policy Committee has looking at these, and certainly we've been working with solid waste and working with the Water Council as well. But also, the cities have been involved, and as you may know, the city and the Cascade Waterline cities, and also Seattle and several other utilities, water utilities, have been trying to work with King County on the clean water plan and the things you're talking about as well. And part of the frustration is this is something we're all working together on, and the billing comes through us, the rates come up in the cities. The money goes into Brightwater or wherever. And it's getting to a point where the lack of solid, trusting relationships is kind of being a drag in terms of us actually all getting together and making these plans work. So I appreciate your perspective on this and trying to work with the college as well. But it's just mind-boggling when you look at what is being proposed in all of these plans having to do with clean water and of course, and to something else like the RI-8 Salmon Recovery Council. We're trying to help the salmon, and it's all tied to water. And water is the thing that keeps it all going. So one kind of message I would put out is let's try to really work even more collectively and trust each other, because it's been very difficult to find out what's going to happen, why the rate's this way, what can we do, when the answer is, don't worry about it, King County's got it covered. And I know you're doing a lot to help in this presentation to actually help that, and we need to do a better job of communicating with the county as well. But appreciate, because this is a humongous problem, and we're all going to have to work with it together. So appreciate very much both of your presentations, and let's keep this in mind at the front. So thank you.
Okay, and if you can comment on whether you support the draft letter or you want to make edits, or you support Councilmember Robertson's proposed so far. I know you probably have more Councilmember Robertson. That would be helpful. Councilmember Zahn.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I support the letter. I do have a couple of comments, and that is at the beginning. I would recommend that instead of us saying we do not have sufficient information to support, I think we might want to have stronger language that says that we don't believe that they've completed their due diligence ahead of adopting the permit, because it isn't about the fact that they have information we haven't seen yet. I believe what I'm hearing is there's work that they haven't done yet related to due diligence. So I don't know that the letter really says that, and I would recommend that we include that part of the language in there. And then the other part I wondered about is it more impactful if we actually had a letter that was signed jointly by a number of cities in King County and not just Bellevue? So that would be another question that I have, instead of it coming from Bellevue, because I know a lot of times in transportation, we will have a joint letter from multiple cities. So that's my comment number 2. And then 3, considering that we're talking about capital investments in the billions, how much influence do we really believe we have with ecology? What success have we had in the past when we have pushed back in this way, when they have permits with conditions that are not maybe as well conceived as we might believe? So thank you.
So Nav, I'm going to continue with the questions and commentary and ask that you, when we're done, answer Councilmember Zahn's questions, and also comment on your opinion of Councilmember Robertson and Zahn's edits to the letter. What do you think the implications of those edits would be? So I like the draft. I'm okay with edits. I'd like to hear more about what Councilmember Robertson wants to add. Are there any other comments or questions? If not, I'll move on back to Council. Oh, sorry, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, I'm supportive of the letter. I'm also supportive of the edits by Councilmember Robertson and Zahn to that. I think this should be, given the implications to our city, I think that should be stronger. And I had 2 questions that you can answer now or later, but and directly from ecology. So and following up on a point by Councilmember Zahn, I can't believe we're the only city that's raised these issues or have a letter ready to go similar to this. So has ecology agreed that more modeling and data might be necessary at this point to determine the impacts, those nutrient discharges or the nitrogen on dissolved oxygen in Puget Sound? Have you heard from them at all? And then also, oh, sorry, go ahead.
We have heard on that, and they believe that the science is complete, and they do not want to further the conversation on the science at this time.
They do not want to further the conversation. Interesting. Well, then why would ecology impose requirements upon nutrient discharges before, I guess, they feel they have the data, but the data doesn't really seem to be there? I guess I'm a bit flummoxed by that by that line of reasoning coming from ecology. So, do you believe that with this, with these types of letters coming from city like Bellevue, that it will have an impact?
I'll quickly respond to that if that's okay, Madam Mayor. I think city letters do have an impact, and I'm delighted to hear you're considering one. We've been talking with a number of cities, SCA members and others, as well as sewer districts, and we've heard pretty strong, pretty uniform support for commenting and sending in letters. Whether it's joint or individual, I think that's up for you to decide, but I think something in Bellevue's voice is very important to this conversation. We supplied template letters, but they're really to get folks started. Telling your own story in your own words is really what's going to get attention. We would discourage any kind of form letter or anything that looks like a form letter that looks too simple.
Absolutely.
And because we've heard what happens from that. And I'll just add to Rebecca's comment. I don't want us to speak for ecology. They should speak for themselves. And I'll say they are good people. They are trying to protect the environment. I don't doubt their motivation to protect Puget Sound. I think we all have that same motivation though. And we want to see areas that are struggling get better. I think we want to be sure that the dollars going towards that are affordable, but going towards a solution that's effective. And I think that's at the heart of this. As Rebecca said, I think that ecology seems very convinced that the science is sufficient to then require the regulations. We're asking whether the requirements under the regulations is really the best cure for the problems that they have identified, especially in those shallow bays. And, you know, if it was a few dollars to do this, nobody would really bat an eye. Right. It's really a lot more than that. So it makes a difference where those dollars go. And when you start going down the road of big infrastructure, it's a big, long road, and you get committed pretty quickly. So that's why we want to try to at least get enough of a conversation before the final permit comes out, so that we can come closer together on our perspectives between ourselves and sounds like maybe Bellevue and our ecology colleagues.
Thank you, Cameron. I appreciate that. And I think, Nob, is there any way we can put added data in the letter in terms of the overall impact of Bellevue specifically? I think that might be helpful as well, beyond the cost estimate of what the $27 billion on capital expenditures. Thank you.
Okay, hold that comment, Nob, to add to all your comments on the recommendations. We're going to go back to Councilmember Robertson for your other 2 questions.
Anyone else have a comment before I go a second time? Okay. So what I've read is that King County has stated that if the permit is approved with the conditions as drafted, that all of King County's resources, including $9 billion that is to be invested over the next 10 years in clean water, will be diverted to the construction of a fourth wastewater treatment plant. And that's how one of the things that's really going to affect rates as well as connection fees for King County. My question for King County is, what are the anticipated costs of compliance with the proposed general permit? And does King County anticipate that sewer rates will increase because of the general permit? And if so, how much?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked the question, and we owe you that information. It is literally in production now, so it'll only be another handful of days before we get it to you. Maybe as early as tomorrow or the next day, you'll have that information. So in time for you to inform your letter. You've got a number in your letter. You might want to, probably needs to change just a little bit, but the rates are looking to be significant. And you mentioned the issue of a fourth plant. We're projecting that if the permit requirements stay as they are, for us to comply, then an additional regional plant looks like it has to be constructed and operated. And that is a very significant cost. We're going to try to provide that information to you, as I said, tomorrow or the next day, so that you have a sense of where these costs and rates are going. And again, this is based on what we're reading in terms of the permit requirements. If we are wrong, we would love to hear from Ecology that we've overshot and that we're, but as far as we can tell, this is what it means. And we're trying to do this transparently so that we all know what goes into that process.
Thanks. So talk about impacts on affordable housing too. So I'm not going to ask any more questions. I think that the council and staff gets a sense of where I am on this. I support all of the revisions to the letters that have been brought forward by Councilmember Zahn and Neuenhaus. I think that we should also make sure that we make the letter consistent with that data that we have that we're going to get from King County, since it has to be done in the 16th. This is our last chance sitting as a council to do it. But I'd like to see a little, like I said, as Councilmember Zahn said, a little bit more aggressive. And I'd like to see something about GMA and growth in there, because that is a real risk of this approach. And so if we could add something about growth in there, and then I would trust staff to redraft the letter. They can send it to council after the meeting, and if any individual council member has an issue. But otherwise, we've got to get this letter out before our next meeting. So I would support, of course, the rest of the council can weigh in. I would support that kind of approach to this letter. And I'm so glad you brought this to us. I think it's so important. Thanks.
Nav, would you like to weigh in on what's been said and what's being proposed, please?
Sure. I can certainly tell you that we don't know enough about what.
Excuse me, Nav, I'm so sorry. Make sure you answer Councilmember Zahn's questions that we tabled too, please.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't write down. A joint letter from multiple cities is what I wrote down. And as Cameron said, a number of cities and districts, sewer districts are creating responses. And I do believe that while we could send a joint letter, I think Bellevue has its own voice. And I would recommend that we send a letter from Bellevue. Each utility, each city, each district's issues may be different. So my thought is that the letter should come from Bellevue.
Okay. And what else? Councilmember Zahn, you asked, I think, two more questions.
Yeah, I had asked the question about what influence we thought we had in the letter, but I believe that Deputy Mayor asked the same question that then was answered already.
And definitely we can make it a stronger that it's not that we don't know, but that more due diligence is needed. I think one of the key things that I would like to put in our letter is that we are uncertain of the science behind this, or we really need a third-party review. We are not scientists. We are not knowledgeable of this. We need somebody who's knowledgeable in the field to do a review of Ecology's proposal. So I would say that we strongly want to word that it needs to they need to do a third-party peer review. And definitely the cost implications are huge. We've got the numbers in our agenda packet that I think were presented by King County to RWQC. And I know that they're developing new numbers, and we will make sure that we translate that into what's the impact to Bellevue. And so that's why in the agenda packet, what we said is for every $1 billion, every $1 billion increase in WTD's annual expenses, that's going to increase our bill by $80 million. So this is not insignificant costs. We will work closely with King County to get the latest numbers of impacts, both capital and operating. As far as the impact on growth, I think I will offline with Cameron to fully understand exactly what the implications are to capacity. I do understand about the cost implications, but I'm not quite clear on why capacity would be impacted. So, but we will work offline with Cameron and his staff to understand that more. But definitely, what is the fix going to work? Is it going to be effective to achieve the outcomes? That is what we are not sure about. And that's what a third-party review would help us to determine. So if at the very least we were able to get that from ecology, I think that would go a long ways in either reassuring us that this is the right path or helping them to understand that perhaps they need to change their direction.
Madam Mayor, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, go ahead, Cameron.
I apologize, I didn't mean to interrupt. I wanted to just emphasize one small point, but I think it's an important one. We'd really recommend that you copy your state legislators on your letter so that you can keep them in this conversation here. That's important. We've already been invited to a state House Environment Committee meeting to talk about this issue in mid-October. And so we'd like to have your legislators, if they're on that committee or other committees that might have jurisdiction, to be clued into Bellevue's perspective and voice. That'll be probably in the middle of the period while ecology staff are working on responding to the comment letters that they've received. So I think it's a good time to continue that conversation. And we want to recommend that you bring in them as well. Thank you.
Nob, do you feel like you've gotten enough direction to make edits on that letter?
We do have enough. And we're looking for some information from King County to complete that, and we'll work with them to get that information and incorporate the edits. And I think, Mayor Robinson, we will work with you then to finalize that letter.
Yes. Councilmember Robertson.
I had written some notes down at the beginning that DOE hadn't completed the scientific review, the nutrient management plan, or the economic impacts analysis. If that's correct, can we specifically ask them for those three things before they adopt a new rule? I don't think those are in the letter.
They're alluded to, but they're not directly touched on.
Can we be a little bit more transparent?
We spell them out?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Maybe in the place where we put in the fact that they haven't done quite the due diligence, that we include these pieces as part of that.
Okay. So is there, let's see. So is there a motion to direct staff to submit the edited letter to ecology?
Yes, ma'am.
I move to submit.
No, I'm going to have Deputy Mayor do it. Thank you, Conrad.
Thank you, Mayor. I move to direct staff to submit a letter to ecology outlining the city's concerns with the draft Puget Sound nutrient general permit, including the edits by Councilmember Robertson, Zahn, and Neuenhuis.
I second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thank you. That passes.
Thank you. Thank you, Cameron.
Thank you very much for the time.
Okay, yes, thank you for coming tonight. Appreciate it. All right, we have a land use ordinance. Deputy Mayor, City Manager, Mr. Miyake.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Mayor, council members. The land use item in front of you is with regard to the Sunset North Lot 10 rezone. This is on your agenda as a quasi-judicial rezone. And given the quasi-judicial nature, I'm going to turn it over to Nick Melosinos, Deputy City Attorney, to introduce the item. Nick.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Mayor and Council members. This is on your agenda as a quasi-judicial rezone. And given the quasi-judicial nature, I'm going to turn it over to Nick Melosinos, Deputy City Attorney, to introduce the item. Nick.
Thank you, Mr. Miyake. Good evening, Mayor and council members. As you heard, the next item of business is final action on the rezone application submitted by Sunset North LLC for a rezone of 7.2 acre site from office limited business to Eastgate transit oriented development and for clarification of associated concomitant zoning agreements. This is a process 3 quasi judicial proceeding. The hearing examiner held a public hearing and then made a recommendation to the council. The hearing examiner recommends approval with conditions and no appeal of that recommendation was filed. As council will recall, at the July 19th council meeting, Drew Folsom, the associate land use planner, provided a brief staff report on the matter. Tonight, this matter is before you for deliberation and vote on the rezone application. For the convenience of the council and in the event that the council votes to approve the application as recommended by the hearing examiner, staff prepared ordinance 6594, which was included in your packets. If council chooses not to approve the rezone application and makes a different decision, then staff will prepare an ordinance following council direction and come back at another meeting. The other options besides approval as recommended by the hearing examiner are to approve with additional conditions, remand back to the hearing examiner for an additional hearing limited to specific issues identified by the council, or to deny the application. Since this is a quasi-judicial matter and therefore subject to the appearance of fairness doctrine, I would recommend, Mayor, that each council member be given an opportunity to disclose on the record any ex parte communications that they may have had with any person supporting or opposing the project prior to your deliberation and vote on the matter. To most efficiently enable council members' disclosures, staff have searched all emails received at council@bellevuelaw.gov and individual council members' city email addresses and have found none. Therefore, council members need to only disclose any contacts received other than through city accounts. Thank you, Mayor.
I'm going to ask each council member if they've had additional ex parte communications. Councilmember Robertson.
I have not.
I'm going to go with me because I'm next on the picture. I have not. Councilmember Stokes. I don't hear you. Sorry, your microphone's off.
Sorry.
Is that okay, Charmaine, or do we need to get that verbally? Your microphone is still off. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. No, I have not.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Zahn.
No, I have not.
Deputy Mayor.
No, I have not.
Councilmember Barksdale.
No, I have not.
Councilmember Lee.
I have not.
Okay, perfect. Go ahead. Is there a presentation on this?
No, that was all, Mayor. If there are any questions, Drew Folsom and Matt McFarland is here as well as myself to answer any questions.
Are there any comments or questions on this proposal tonight to pass this application and adopt the ordinance? All right, seeing none, is there a motion?
I move to adopt ordinance 6594, approving with conditions the rezone application of the Sunset North Lot 10 rezone submitted by Sunset North LLC. A rezone is of a 7.2 acre site located at 3002 139th Avenue Southeast from office limited business to Eastgate transit oriented development and for clarification of associate concomitant zoning agreements.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, that passes. Thank you. We have another ordinance that we're going to look at, Mr. Miyake.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor and council members. You have two ordinances under ordinances and resolutions in your packet this evening. The first one is Ordinance 6595, which is intended to refinance the city's existing TIFIA loan, which will result in significant savings to the city. Joining us this evening to answer any questions you may have on this is Tony Call, our Director of Finance and Asset Management, as well as Ron Kessick, Assistant Director in our Transportation Department, as well as our bond counsel, Stacey Lewis from Pacifica Law. This was presented to the council earlier this year. So with that, we open up any questions you might have before taking action on this ordinance.
Are we going to hear from somebody, or?
If you'd like, we could give a brief staff report, but we were really originally just opening it up for questions from the council.
Are there any comments or questions? Okay, council members on.
Well, I just have to thank staff for wholeheartedly for doing this work to reduce our interest rate and save so much money. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other comments or questions? Councilmember Lee.
I move to approve this ordinance.
Okay, there's a motion to adopt the ordinance 6595.
Second.
Is there a second? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, thank you very much. We have one more ordinance.
Yeah. You want me to just move on? To
well,
this,
let's go. Yeah, let's move on. And I know that council members on and Deputy Mayor Newhouse are going to recuse themselves. So I'm going to allow them to do that first.
Yes, thank you, Mayor.
Good night.
Thank you.
Have a nice.
Good night. Thank you.
Have a nice break.
You as well.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Miyake.
Thank you, Mayor. Ordinance 6596 adopts the Human Service Commission's 21 to 22 House Bill 1590 funding recommendation and authorizes the city manager as designee to enter into contracts with local human service agencies in accordance with the recommendations. Joining us this evening is Matt Cummins, Director of the Community Development, to answer any questions you may have on this particular ordinance.
Are there any comments or questions? Raise your hand. Seeing none, I'm just going to say bless you, everybody, for making this possible for our community. It's incredible. Very grateful. So is there a, okay, we've lost our deputy mayor. So who would like to make
I'll make a motion.
All right.
I move to adopt the ordinance adopting the Human Services Commission's 2021-2022 HB 1590 funding recommendations, authorizing the city manager or designee to enter into contracts with local human services agencies in accordance with the recommendations, amending ordinance 6557 adopted December 14th, 2020 as previously amended to increase the appropriations to the 2021-2022 Housing Trust Fund and Human Services Fund, each in the amount of $1,659,422.
Well, this is a motion, just to clarify, to adopt ordinance 6596. So there's the second. Okay, all those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, excellent. Well, that is the end of our meeting. Thank you all for your excellent discussion. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a nice month off, and I will see you in September.
Same to you.
Good night.